I sense something off the instant I enter my driveway and observe an unfamiliar SUV occupying my garage as if it belonged there. The car did not belong to my sister. It did not belong to my neighbor, and it certainly was not mine. The most unfavorable aspect? The garage door stood ajar, as though the universe was illuminating the folly of the situation in full daylight. I had been absent for merely 8 hours, and in that brief period, someone had usurped my property like a lion delineates its territory. Initially, I suspected it might be an error. An unidentified delivery truck is utilizing my area to execute a turnaround, possibly a disoriented Uber driver. However, upon exiting my vehicle and gaining a clearer perspective, my intuition suggested that this was fundamentally different. The car was parked impeccably, suggesting the driver had meticulously ensured its precise placement. The door was secured. Moreover, an iced coffee, half consumed, rested on the hood, its condensation still evident, indicating recent human presence. I approached my front door, verified that no other items had been altered, and proceeded directly to the neighbor's residence. It was at that moment that I encountered her, Karen. She emerged before I could knock, exiting her residence with a confidence derived from a lifetime of evading consequences. Concise bob hairstyle, enormous sunglasses, and a demeanor that boldly invited confrontation. "Excuse me," I stated, endeavoring to maintain a neutral tone. "Are you aware of the owner of the car in my garage?" She had no hesitation whatsoever. "Indeed, it belongs to me." Quietude. I closed and opened my eyes rapidly. She imbibed her beverage. "I beg your pardon. What did you say?" "I parked there," she reiterated, as if that somehow resolved the matter. "I required the space." I chuckled, anticipating her to reveal it was a jest, yet she merely gazed at me as if I were the one being irrational. "Did you park in my garage?" I inquired, ensuring I was not experiencing a hallucination. She derided. "It was devoid. What is the significance? You are not utilizing it at all. This is likely to pose an issue." I inhaled deeply, clutching the bridge of my nose to maintain composure. "Karen, this is my estate. Parking in my garage is not permissible based only on your inclination." She expressed her disdain by rolling her eyes. "I was in a rush, and your driveway's incline was excessive for my SUV. You own ample space, and I reasoned that since you were absent, there would be no detriment." The blatant boldness nearly elicited laughter from me. "Nearly? The detriment lies in its illegality," I stated, my tolerance waning. "You are encroaching on private property. Relocate your vehicle." She folded her arms. "I shall. However, I have errands to complete, so I will attend to it later." Subsequently, I reiterated, now genuinely laughing in incredulity. "No, you will relocate it immediately." Karen emitted an exaggerated sigh, as if I were an unreasonable landlord demanding timely rent payment. "I am unable to do so. I am socializing with my friends. Simply be a considerate neighbor and allow it to be." Consequently, she pivoted and re-entered her residence, closing the door before me. I remained stationary, jaw tightened, unable to comprehend the recent events. I have encountered some entitled individuals, but Karen was functioning on an entirely distinct level. I might have contacted the authorities. I could have arranged for her vehicle to be towed. However, her self-satisfied sneer as she dismissed me kindled a more trivial resentment within me. Acceptable. She was eager to park in my garage. She may reside in my garage. I promptly returned to my residence, retrieved the garage door remote, and secured it manually from within. I subsequently secured the side door with a deadbolt, verified all measures again, and ensured there was no ingress or egress. What follows? I prepared my luggage and departed for a week. At this juncture, the situation became particularly intriguing. At that moment, I was unaware that Karen had entered the garage prior to my locking it. She likely returned to retrieve an item from her car, presuming she could enter and exit at her convenience. However, with the door secured and no means to unlock it from within without the remote, she was ensnared. While I was midway to my holiday location, enjoying a beverage in the sun, Karen was confined in my garage, accompanied solely by her purse and the belongings from her vehicle. Upon returning home, the community was starting to recognize her absence. Her husband, Greg, appeared somewhat apprehensive yet predominantly apathetic. I subsequently discovered that he had presumed she had embarked on a shopping excursion or a girls' retreat. However, Susan, her closest companion and fellow dramatist, began to pose inquiries. Simultaneously, within the garage, Karen was realizing the extent of her constrained options. She lacked phone coverage, had no sustenance other from some expired protein bars I had overlooked, and, most critically, no functional bathroom. She struck the walls, shouted for assistance, and attempted to manipulate the latch with a bobby pin. Nevertheless, the garage door remained obstinately closed. By the third day, she was in a state of desperation. She exhausted all options, striking the walls at night, sounding the horn, and even attempting to navigate through the doggy door in an absurd manner that I wish I had recorded on security camera. Simultaneously, I remained oblivious, relishing my journey without any disruptions, until I received a message from an unfamiliar number. "Assist me, you fiend." I gazed at the screen, perplexed. Subsequently, another message appeared. "You can find me, you sociopath. Release me." At that moment, I comprehended the occurrence. Karen did not merely park in my garage. She had positioned herself in my garage. What now? She now desired to exit. However, I was not in any haste to resolve her issue. Ultimately, she had instructed me to be a good neighbor and permit her to park there. Had she not? I smirked, stowed my phone, and ordered an additional drink. Karen was capable of waiting. By the second day, Karen had experienced a spectrum of emotions: anger, denial, bargaining, and profound desperation. She yelled, kicked the walls, honked the car horn repeatedly until the battery was practically depleted, and even struck the garage door with an iron she discovered in the trunk. However, nothing proved effective. The garage door was securely closed, and no one had arrived to assist her. She was beginning to realize that she might be confined here for an extended while. Initially, she had persuaded herself that someone would listen to her. Ultimately, she was Karen, and Karen invariably achieved her desires. A neighbor would undoubtedly observe her disappearance. Perhaps Greg would discern that anything was amiss and seek her out. However, as time elapsed, reality became apparent. Greg was not particularly astute, and in truth, he likely appreciated the tranquility. What about the neighbors? They lacked sufficient regard for her to express concern. The sole individual capable of resolving this issue was Jake, who was leisurely enjoying margaritas in a distant location, entirely oblivious, or perhaps acutely cognizant, of her predicament. She needed to endure. The initial challenge was sustenance and hydration. A brief examination of her purse uncovered breath mints, a crumpled granola bar wrapper containing only crumbs, and a partially filled bottle of expensive alkaline water. It was insufficient, yet it would suffice. She meticulously searched the car, sifting through the glove compartment and center console akin to a raccoon foraging through refuse, a windfall of stale crackers, a melting chocolate bar, and an expired energy drink. It was not precisely a gourmet dish. Nevertheless, it was preferable to having nothing. The condition of the bathroom presented a completely distinct ordeal. After enduring for as long as possible, she ultimately conceded and utilized an empty Starbucks cup in the rear seat. It was degrading, repugnant, and an experience she would never mention again. She vowed that as soon as she exited this place, she would litigate against Jake to the fullest extent. She would ensure he lamented ever antagonizing her. By the third day, she began to unravel. The garage walls seemed to constrict, the air reeked of automotive fumes and despair, and she had engaged in excessive internal conflict. She attempted to sleep, but the automobile seats were uncomfortable, and the pervasive silence was disconcerting. Each creak, every distant canine yelp, and every vehicle passing outside caused her heart to speed. She would have sacrificed anything for her phone, but the signal was absent in the garage, and her battery had expired nonetheless. At one moment, she conceived the ingenious notion of escaping through the dog door of the side entry. It was a little flap designed for a golden retriever, not an adult human, yet her desperation compelled her to attempt it. She positioned herself prone, maneuvered forward, and successfully extricated her head. The remainder of her, however, was uncooperative. Her shoulders were excessively broad, her hips remained immobile, and she found herself in a state of limbo, caught between entry and exit, resembling a pitiable cartoon character. After 20 minutes of exertion, vocal distress, and profound humiliation, she ultimately succeeded in re-entering. She was approaching her limit. Concurrently, in reality, circumstances were becoming increasingly dubious. Susan, Karen's closest companion, had begun inquiring among others. Greg, having relished several serene days, was starting to observe that his wife had not communicated with him via text for some time. He had presumed she was either shopping or enjoying a spa day. However, upon receiving Susan's fourth call, indicating that something might indeed be amiss, he had to concede that it was quite peculiar. Greg ultimately approached Jake's residence and rapped on the door. Upon receiving no response, he surveyed the premises, verifying whether Karen's vehicle remained parked in the vicinity. The garage was securely shut, and in the absence of any apparent indication of his wife, Greg resignedly returned home. If she were in distress, she would have certain that everyone was informed. In the garage, Karen had reached a level of madness where she began conversing with inanimate objects. The iced coffee cup from earlier had transformed into Wilson, her sole companion. She engaged in extensive dialogues with it, attributing her plight to Jake, reproaching Greg for his failure to notice her absence, and condemning the world for permitting such an occurrence to befall someone of her significance. Wilson, naturally, offered no reply, which only intensified her anger. In a moment of desperation, she recalled something. The garage contained a small window positioned toward the ceiling. Although it was insufficiently large for her to traverse, there remained a possibility that she could attract someone's attention. She accumulated various objects, ascended the bonnet of her car, then the roof, ultimately reaching the window. She observed the street beyond. Liberty was tantalizingly near, yet frustratingly distant. She shouted for assistance, flailing her arms frantically, however no one was around. The sole individual who passed by was Mr. Jenkins, the elderly neighbor who consistently donned noise-canceling headphones during his daily stroll. He did not even cast a peek in her direction. Her final recourse was to honk the horn once more, but, having depleted the automobile battery previously, that option was no longer viable. She was immobilized, vanquished, confined in a garage that she had previously regarded as her private parking area. At that moment, having resigned herself to her fate, she perceived the vibration of her phone in the cup holder. Descending hastily, she reached for it, hoping that her charge was sufficient. The display was unilluminated. Deceased, she swore, shaking it in an attempt to reactivate it, but it was futile. She remained ensnared, still powerless. Subsequently, to exacerbate her distress, she discerned the unmistakable sound of a vehicle entering the driveway. Her heart surged. Ultimately, at last, an individual had arrived to save her. However, upon recognizing the individual, her relief transformed into unadulterated fury. It was Jake. The garage door began to ascend, inundating the area with fresh air and sunlight. Once it reached the midpoint, Karen sprang forth with fervor, her eyes wild, seething with anger, and poised to release her accumulated frustration. Jake, meanwhile, remained stationary, consuming a beverage as if he had not abandoned her for a whole week. He remarked, smirking, that it appeared someone had a noteworthy experience. Karen experienced intense anger. She intended to annihilate him. Karen had never experienced such an intensity of fury in her life. Upon emerging from the garage, her eyes wide and appearance disordered, she scarcely inhaled before erupting into an intense, screaming episode. Conversely, Jake maintained an exasperatingly nonchalant demeanor. leisurely sipping his iced coffee as though he had only returned from a routine grocery excursion rather than from a week of inadvertently confining a hostage in his garage. "You complete psychopath," Karen shrieked, her voice raspy from days of vocal exertion in the confined area. "You confined me within that space. You abandoned me to decay. Are you aware of my experiences?" Jake elevated an eyebrow, undeterred. "I believed you would relocate your vehicle upon my request. It appears that did not occur." Karen's hands clenched into fists, her nails penetrating her palms. She was soiled, fatigued, dehydrated, and utterly mortified. The odor of rancid energy beverages and perspiration adhered to her. Her formerly impeccably straightened haircut was now frizzed beyond identification. She had devoted days to devising her retribution, envisioning every conceivable method to inflict suffering on Jake for his transgressions. And now that she was finally liberated, she intended to ensure he would deeply regret his actions. "I'm contacting the authorities," she hissed, pointing a quivering finger at him. "You will be incarcerated for this. This is illegal confinement. I trust you have competent legal representation, as your situation is dire." Jake swallowed another deliberate sip of his beverage. "Proceed." Karen hesitated momentarily. He was not in a state of panic. He was not at all concerned. He extracted his phone from his pocket and unlocked it. "Shall I make the call on your behalf? Would you want to utilize mine, as your charge is likely depleted?" For a little moment, Karen paused. There was an anomaly. What accounted for his lack of fear? Why was he not hastily elucidating his actions? His calm and cool gaze at her instilled a sense of discomfort in her gut. Prior to her response, Jake approached his vehicle and opened the trunk. He extracted a compact security camera from his hand and tapped the display. Interestingly, he persisted, entirely disregarding Karen's imminent outburst. "I installed surveillance cameras around my property some time ago, and they have been filming continuously." Karen's lips became parched. He oriented the screen towards her, allowing the footage to play. She approached his driveway confidently, dismissively waving her hand at him when he requested that she relocate her vehicle. She stood there, disdainfully turning her back on him, asserting that she would relocate it at her convenience. Furthermore, the final embellishment. She was stealthily entering the garage to retrieve an item from her car just before he secured it and departed. Jake smiled broadly. "Thus, you effectively confined yourself. I was unaware that you remained inside when I departed." Karen's lips parted, seeking a form of rebuttal, although none materialized. He possessed evidence. Proof. Her entire case disintegrated abruptly. However, Jake persisted, returning his phone to his pocket, and urged, "Contact the authorities. I will be delighted to provide this to them. I am confident they would be quite intrigued to learn about your unauthorized entry onto my property, your unpermitted parking in my garage, your refusal to vacate, and your subsequent entrapment. I believe the legal terminology for such is breaking and entering, although my knowledge may be limited. I am not an attorney." Karen's visage flushed. This was not the intended outcome. She was intended to be the victim in this scenario, the one exerting control and compelling him to seek her forgiveness. However, her entire thesis was not only refuted, but she was perilously close to facing legal repercussions herself. She required the restoration of control. "You cannot substantiate that I was present for an entire week," she retorted. "To the best of anyone's knowledge, I was merely present for a few hours." Jake exhibited a sneer. "Are you referring to anything other than the messages you transmitted to me?" Karen became immobile. Jake unlocked his phone once more and perused his text before elevating the screen. Karen's urgent texts appeared before her, each one pleading for assistance. "Assist me, you fiend. You can find me, you sociopath. Release me. I have been present for several days. I am experiencing mental distress." Jake elevated his eyebrows. "It is not precisely like the account of an individual who spent several hours inside, does it?" Karen gritted her teeth to the extent that her jaw throbbed. She sensed her control eluding her grasp like sand, and she despised it. Subsequently, to further the situation, her husband Greg ultimately chose to appear. He entered the driveway, exiting the vehicle with a perplexed demeanor. "Hello, where have you been?" Susan stated that she had not received any communication from you for several days. Karen spun around, struggling to maintain her composure. "Greg, this individual confined me in his garage for a week." Greg glanced at Jake, then at the security camera he held, and finally back at Karen. "Were you in his garage? What is the reason?" "I parked briefly, after which he secured it. He perpetrated this against me." Greg massaged the nape of his neck. "What prompted you to park in his garage?" Karen's mouth opened and then closed. "This is not the crux of the matter, Greg." Jake acknowledged Greg with a cordial nod. "Your wife unlawfully entered my property, declined to relocate her vehicle, and subsequently became trapped in my garage during my absence on a trip. I have recorded everything, including the moment she texted me to request her release." Greg released a slow breath. "Karen, did you truly accomplish that?" Karen was poised to yell. This was degrading. She had endured days of anguish, anticipating unanimous support upon her release, yet suddenly her own husband was interrogating her. Jake struck his hands together. "I will not pursue legal action, but I will be implementing a new security system to prevent a recurrence of this incident." Karen derided. "I would never park in your garage again, you maniac." Jake smiled broadly. "Acceptable. Thus, we are in agreement." Karen fumed, experiencing profound defeat. This is not concluded. She would devise a method to retaliate against him. She was compelled to, however, as if the universe intended to administer one more strike. Her phone vibrated with a notification. A penalty, a substantial one, from the Homeowners Association. The communication was unequivocal. Illicit appropriation of a fellow resident's property, several grievances from neighbors, and a resolution by the HOA to rescind her community privileges for an entire year. Access to the pool is prohibited. No. Reservations for the clubhouse. Nothing. Jake rendered a slight salute to her. "Farewell, Karen." Karen desired to vocalize her frustration. She desired to engage in combat. However, there remained no further actions to undertake. Left with little alternative, she marched back to Greg's car, utterly embarrassed. Greg, in the interim, merely exhaled a sigh. "Should I inquire at all?" "Drive," Karen said, crossing her arms. Consequently, Greg engaged the reverse gear and departed with them. Jake saw their departure, then redirected his attention to his garage, shaking his head in bemusement. He emerged victorious. Was the most advantageous aspect. Karen had brought this upon herself.